This is Koom for comiccon.com, and I'm here with Jen Jackson, who's one of the founders of the BC Environmental Film Festival. Hi, Jen. How are you?
Hi, thanks for having me.
So tell us about your film festival, when it is, and how people can access it.
Yeah, so our first inaugural online film festival is December 10th to 15th, 2021. You can get more information from our website, which is www.bceff.org. And on there's links to our Facebook page, which is where you can sign up as an RSVP for the festival, and then we'll send you more information as the time draws near.
Yeah, awesome. So tell us a bit about your aims for the festival and how you got involved.
Yeah, so I'll tell you a bit about the history of BCEFF. It started actually in April, so we're quite recent. And it started, I'm a scientist, an oceanographer, and I actually study the physics of the ocean. And I have a good friend who's a filmmaker. And we've been having all these conversations about, science and climate change and how so much is happening in the world. Yet, as a scientist, I feel like my voice isn't always heard. I'm finding new things and gaining new knowledge, but it just doesn't make it to the public very often. And I was lamenting this to my friend and wishing that scientists had a bigger voice. And he said, well, we should found an environmental film festival then and build a community that brings filmmakers and scientists together. So at least they can start having these conversations and ultimately they can start working together.
Yeah, you were saying your voice is not heard. Do you find that that's true in general, or did you mean within the scientific community?
My voice is heard within the scientific community, but the scientific community itself is really siloed. So the process of doing research is, I have an idea, I look at some data, I ask a question, I examine the data to see whether or not I can answer the question, and then I write up a paper that eventually will get published. And it sits in the peer review literature. But that's not something that most people will read or become familiar with. And so unless it gets picked up by a journalist or someone in media, that information doesn't really become public knowledge. And that's the frustrating part, because we find out so many things about how, for example, the oceans are changing, but it's just not common knowledge for most people.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is more like an activist role for you. Is this a new direction for you?
Absolutely, yeah. I've been well entrenched into the scientific world for more than 20 years now, and so this is a brand new venture. I've never done anything this public before, and it's really exciting to think that some of this information can really make it into the public.
And how do you go about getting that message across through selecting or curating the films that you're showing?
Yeah, so for our first festival, we already have more than 80 films that have been submitted from over 20 countries. So it's really exciting, and there's this really beautiful breadth of film. And we have a selection team that's made up of scientists and filmmakers and others as well, some students, and each film is watched by at least 10 people from a broad, diverse background. And one of the things we're checking for is scientific accuracy. Mm-hmm. So once we narrow those 80 films down to about 15 or 20 that we're going to screen, we're going to have scientists in the relevant fields watch them and just ensure that the science has been fact-checked and accurate. And if it's not, we'll still screen the film, but we can start a conversation about, what is incorrect in the film and what is correct. That's the ultimate vision that we want to have. Though we have to be really careful. I mean, filmmakers are amazing and their art is amazing, and we don't want to, I guess, insult anyone. We want to build a relationship where people feel comfortable sharing the ideas and talking together. And so our job isn't to go out and criticize people, but our job is to, what we envision is that, the scientists and the filmmakers can sit down and have a conversation about what the filmmaker is showing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I do remember when we originally talked, maybe almost a couple of months ago, you did kind of feel very rooted in your feminist ideas.
Yes.
And you had a certain kind of outlook as to the kinds of voices you wanted to promote.
Yeah.
Do you still feel as strongly, or has the last couple of months kind of wearied you down a bit?
No, I mean, most science, especially the physical sciences in the world, is still really dominated by men, and particularly white men.
Mm-hmm.
And I think side by side with fighting climate change, diversity is really important because, the world is made up of 7.8 billion people, and we need all of those voices to come together to solve something that's as big and as urgent as climate change. And if only a few of those voices are coming through, then it doesn't show the whole picture of what's happening in the world. So yes, on the side and in my other career as an oceanographer, I'm very passionate about trying to bring as many voices to the table as possible. There are inherent biases within science because, the people whose worldview is doing the research, it's going to ultimately come through in the science. And so in order to break those worldviews down, we need to bring more people to the table.
Sure, this might be a good moment to ask you about your oceanography and what that entails.
Yeah, so I'm a physical oceanographer, which means that I study the physics of the ocean. And I started off with my PhD in studying the Arctic Ocean and studying how heat from the sun is stored in the ocean and ultimately melts sea ice in the wintertime. And from there I moved to South Africa, and I worked on the Agulhas Bank, which is this beautiful area just off the southern end of South Africa. And I studied how the Agulhas Current, which is sort of like the Gulf Stream in South Africa, how it interacts with the coastline and ultimately influences a lot of the animals that live there. And then from there, I moved to the University of Washington, where I continued some of the Arctic work. And then I moved to Victoria, and ultimately I got a job at the Hakai Institute in 2015. And I've been studying the coastal waters of British Columbia since then. I've been mainly focusing on the fjords or the inlets. There's more than 50 inlets in British Columbia.
Wow.
And we have these really beautiful time series in a lot of the inlets. There was an oceanographer by the name of George Pickard who was at the University of British Columbia, and he started collecting data in 1951 in probably about 20 inlets in BC. Sometimes monthly, sometimes yearly, but it's just a beautiful time series of temperature and oxygen and how salty the water is. And he continued on until the 1980s. And then there were some gaps in the data collection, but when the Hakai Institute started in 2012, they started picking up some of the sampling. And so now we have monthly sampling in Rivers Inlet and in Butte Inlet, and Toba Inlet as well. We're starting to study Herbert Inlet in collaboration with a number of partners in Clayoquot Sound. And we've started studying Burke Channel as well. And so when we start putting all of these really long time series together, we're seeing that the waters in some of these inlets are changing really rapidly and at much greater rates or faster paces than other parts in the ocean. In particular, they're warming and losing oxygen at a fast rate.
Yeah, and you were saying that, I think around the first time that I met you, that we're at a point that's extremely alarming now.
Yes, yeah. So over the past 70 years, the deep water in these inlets has warmed by about 1.2 to 1.3 degrees Celsius. And that's an enormous change in the ocean. And most animals are only adapted to deal with maybe like a 5, maybe 10 degrees Celsius temperature range. And when it gets too warm and it gets too cold, they get really stressed. And that can impact, whether they can grow or whether they can reproduce. And right now we're at the upper end, temperature-wise, for a lot of the species that we care about on the coast. And if it gets much warmer, then, they will start being impacted. And one of the big changes that we're seeing as well is where we sit in British Columbia. We're sort of between the subtropical waters in California and the subarctic waters in Alaska. We're in this transition zone. And in the sort of California waters, you have these type of zooplankton or tiny bugs in the water column that lots of things eat. that are not that nutritious. They're quite lipid poor. They're not that fatty. They're almost like junk food for a lot of fish that eat them. But in the subarctic waters, there's a lot of really nutritious zooplankton that live there. They have lots of fat. They're really healthy. And so fish have to eat less of them in order to meet all of their nutritional requirements. And what's happening as the waters warm up, we're seeing more and more of these southern sort of junk food type zooplankton in the waters in British Columbia and fewer of the subarctic ones. And we think that in itself is having a really big impact on what fish and can live here and how different species thrive. And it's ultimately sort of the southward migration of animals moving into BC. So that's the shift that is already well underway and that we're seeing, and that was amplified by the 2014 to 2016 marine heat wave that was called the Blob. That was a huge event. It lasted almost 2 years, and it really influenced what zooplankton and fish we're seeing in the coastal waters of BC.
Are you linked to a network of oceanographers or researchers who are seeing the same thing all over the world?
Yeah, it's mainly this sort of California through Alaska network that are seeing the same things for the zooplankton species. And that's partly because of the marine heat wave. It's led to a lot of new research in this region. Mm-hmm. But other parts of the ocean are seeing warming and sort of the southern expansion of subtropical waters. And so southern or northern, towards the poles, it's, the subarctic area is getting smaller and the subtropical area is getting larger. And so, yes, that's absolutely happening everywhere. And it's influencing everything, including the wind patterns that we see.
So are you finding that when you do this research, you mentioned that you file a report, but do you feel any pushback either from government or corporate interests who don't really want that message to come out?
Not necessarily pushback, and I think that that's why it's really important for scientists to approach their science as non-biased. Mm-hmm. And that's why a lot of the research funding, at least in North America, is either from government or different foundations that don't have a specific mandate. Mm-hmm. So yeah, my job is to go out and look at the data and come up with new facts, and it's not biased in either direction. But again, there is no pushback because I think a lot of these facts just don't really make it into the public eye. So if news stories like this were reported, then maybe there would be more pushback. Yeah.
I guess I was just wondering whether, like, the government that ends up funding your research, if it's not in line with their policies, might, but it doesn't sound like that's...
No, and I have to say that at least the Canadian government right now is very, they're trying very hard to do climate change research in the oceans, and there is a lot of funding for that. And, the sort of big four changes that we're seeing, and all government policy has been streamlined to really examine these four big changes. They're warming, the loss of oxygen, the ocean becoming more acidic, and then the fourth is marine plastics. So most of the research that's happening in Canada now is being tailored to meet those four big issues.
So to bring it back to the festival, how do you feel that, I know you haven't figured out your lineup just yet, but how do you feel like your potential films reflect what you're feeling in your professional life, or does it really not really feel like the same pattern?
Yeah, that's interesting. We've had some really phenomenal films that have come in, really exciting, that tell some great stories of what's happening around the world, stories of hope, stories of science, a lot of stories about Indigenous knowledge and how that's being shared to sort of create stories of hope as well. Mm-hmm. And a very big international perspective. As I mentioned, we've had more than 20 films submitted from all over the world. So to me, it's really interesting to think about how others are thinking about these issues and approaching these issues as well. The science question, there hasn't been any films, well, there have been maybe one or two that are directly linked to the research that I've done, and it's interesting watching them from a scientist's point of view. And I, it'll be interesting to see whether other people think about it as well. I do think in general, and not talking about these films in particular, but scientists are not very good at representing themselves and not particularly good at telling stories to the public either. We're not very good at communicating our science. So part of the reason that our voices aren't heard is because we're not very good at telling the stories in an engaging way that gets people excited about it. And that's where I think this relationship between filmmakers and scientists is really exciting because ultimately we hope that filmmakers can help tell those stories to science, those science stories.
Is it hard to get a film festival going?
Yeah, it's. I've never done anything like this before, and I'm very lucky. One of our co-founders, Pejman Hadavi, he's organized more than 200 events, so I would be completely lost without his expertise. And I mean, there certainly is a lot of work involved, everything from building your own website, advertising, trying to get the word out, advertising for movie submissions as well, watching all the films, and we're at the stage now where we'll start making selections in the coming weeks. We are very lucky. We have a very amazing board of advisors. So we also have some wonderful people to help guide us through this process. But yeah, our advisors are from, 3 different countries, all across Canada, from Cyprus, from Iran, and, very successful in their own fields. So it's been amazing to work with them and help build this idea.
Cool. You've got BC in the title. So really, how BC is the film festival?
Well, it's very international, actually. We wanted to put British Columbia in the title because, well, for one, we all live here and it's our home, but also because British Columbia in itself is a place where films are made, where there's wonderful science being done, and it evokes images of beautiful mountains and oceans, and we feel very close to those images as well, again, because it is our home. Though we are, as a team, very international. We have, I think we counted the other day, and we have family in almost 10 different countries that are, close, and that's immediate family. So, in and ourselves, we are very international. And so we also like the idea of making the film festival as international as possible.
Great. I know that you're still picking films, but do you want to talk about any particular films that you're really excited about and tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, I'll have to be really careful here. I should say we've gotten, I believe, over 15 films from Iran, and some of them are so good, and we actually, one of our board of advisors, Bahram Radan, he's a movie star in Iran, and he's going to be coming to Canada to actually screen some of his films in April. So we'll do a screening tour with him. So we won't be showing his films in our festival, but they're phenomenal. I really enjoyed watching them. We got a number of films from East Timor that were really beautiful to watch. We've had films from all over Europe. I'm really loving the short films right now. It's amazing what a powerful message people can tell in just 5 minutes. And again, some really beautiful, straightforward stories that I've learned a lot from. Have a lot of documentaries as well that have come in, and some that are climate change specific, some that are targeting specific animals, but again, some really interesting stories that are coming in, powerful as well. It's amazing how powerful a filmmaker can make the storyline. and again in a way that I think most scientists wouldn't be able to come across that way. So yeah, it's I'm enjoying the climate change ones because I feel like it's giving my research a voice that it hasn't had before.
Are the films accompanied by any sort of lecture or informational?
Yeah, that's going to be the idea. So it is online, but when we select the films, we're hoping, maybe not with all of them, but maybe with a select few, to have a question and answer period, hopefully involving the filmmaker and also a scientist. We're also hoping to get a strong presence of Indigenous knowledge holders as well. Very often their knowledge is misrepresented in film. I think we can all think of many examples of that happening, especially in North America. And we, I think just as important as it is to represent Western science properly, it's also equally important to represent Indigenous knowledge. Mm-hmm. So we're working with some Indigenous knowledge holders and are hoping that they also will be able to speak to the authenticity of the films that their knowledge is represented in. So yeah, that's another big piece, and it's another piece, I think, of the diversity of information that we need to gather as we try and solve these really big problems that we have facing us right now.
Do you have more documentaries and features, or vice versa?
Yeah, I think we have the most short films right now, actually, and then that's followed by documentaries and then fewer feature films. We're trying to have films that have some sort of environmental focus, of course, but we've made a really broad definition of the environment, mainly to see, what sort of films are out there, especially for our first film festival. And we made the definition, we've got, it could be about the physical or the chemical or the biological environment, or a film could be about a social impact of different environmental issues, or the film could be about, the mental health impact of some of these environmental issues as well. It can be about climate wars. It can be about groups that are especially Indigenous groups that are really impacted by some of the changes that we're seeing. So again, yeah, really broad definition that we've had, and that's led to a lot of really interesting and broad films that have come in.
Cool.
Yeah.
So you were saying it's all online, so in a way it really is open to anybody. It's an international film festival in that way. Can you talk a little bit more about which days again that they'll be playing? Do people only have those days to access the films? How do they access the films? Yeah,
so we're setting up sort of Eventive right now, which is our streaming service. I believe we're still looking into it, but I think that'll be Eventive, and so people can go online to our Facebook page and RSVP or say they're going to attend the event, and as soon as we have a ticketing set up, which will happen in the next couple of weeks, they can start reserving their tickets. We're planning for it to be a free event. And so, yeah, people will just have to go online and get their tickets. And so it will be December the 10th to the 15th. And we're still figuring out time zones because it is so international. We want to make sure that it is open to as many people in the world, and people don't have to watch at 2 a.m. So that might mean that we have
So if you get
screenings.
A ticket, you can't watch it on your own time. You have to watch it when it plays.
We're still figuring that one out as well. Ultimately we'd like it to be on people's own time, but we're still working out the details on that. But, we have, like I said, we're really international, and we've heard of screening parties in Iran and South Africa and Kenya, Holland, France. So people are going to be gathering together to watch the films as well.
That's great.
Yeah.
And so we'll definitely include links.
Great.
But is there anything else you would like to add that we haven't touched on?
No, I mean, I think it's great to know who our audience are. So if people want to reach out to us and give us their feedback, that would be really wonderful. And they can either go to our website that has contact information.
Why don't you say what it is and
Sure.
your Facebook?
Sure, yeah. Well, yeah. It's www.bceff.org. And there is a link right on that webpage to all of our social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube. But it's on the Facebook page that you can sign up for the event.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay.